The streets glistening under the golden lights of the Montgomery Royal Hotel. Cars lined up at the entrance, their doors swinging open to release elegantly dressed guests who disappeared through the grand revolving doors, their laughter echoing into the night. Across the street, in the shadows, stood a woman no one noticed. Ella Montgomery gripped the handle of the mop in her trembling hands. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a battle between fear and determination raging inside her. A few weeks ago, she had been one of those guests. Dripping in diamonds, stepping onto red carpets, sipping champagne at the rooftop lounge. But tonight, she was just another invisible worker, dressed in a faded janitor's uniform 2 sizes too big, her hair tucked under a stained cap, her face smudged with dirt. No one could know who she really was. Her father, Richard Montgomery, had built this empire from nothing. A small-time businessman who had turned a tiny motel into one of the most luxurious hotel chains in the world. People had called him a visionary, a man of power and prestige. But he had also been a father, the only family Ella had left. When he died, the world wept for the billionaire, but Ella grieved for the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had taught her how to swim in the ocean, who had whispered bedtime stories about courage and honor. Now, the hotel was hers, but something wasn't right. Hey there, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update, and show some love by clicking the like button. We'd also love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city in the comments below. She had heard the whispers at the funeral, silent murmurs of corruption, of cruelty behind the hotel's golden doors. Guests spoke of luxury, but workers spoke in hushed voices about managers who treated them like slaves, of money disappearing, of an unseen rot spreading through her father's legacy. Ella couldn't sit in an office and trust reports. She needed to see it herself. So, she became someone else. Taking a deep breath, she clutched the mop tighter and walked through the grand entrance. A pianist played a soft melody in the corner, and the scent of expensive perfume filled the air. Everywhere, men in tailored suits and women in flowing gowns moved with effortless grace. And yet, as Ella stepped forward, she became invisible. A businessman brushed past her, nearly knocking the mop from her hands without a glance. A woman in diamonds wrinkled her nose and stepped aside, as though she smelled something foul. The hotel guests, who once would have greeted her with warm smiles when she was their equal, now looked through her as if she did not exist. The real test had begun. She shuffled toward the cleaning supply closet, trying to act as if she belonged. Inside, another janitor, a tired-looking woman with gray streaks in her hair, glanced up inside. "New girl," she muttered, barely meeting Ella's eyes. Ella nodded. "Better move fast," the woman warned. "If Mrs. Glades catches you slacking, you won't last the night." Ella swallowed. Mrs. Glades. That was a name she had never heard before. Before she could ask, the woman thrust a bucket into her hands. "Lobby floor needs mopping. And don't let the guests see you doing it. They hate that." Ella turned away, pushing the mop bucket toward the marble floor, her mind racing. She had thought this mission would be about spying on the managers, about watching the money flow. But now she realized there was something else, something she had never considered. The workers weren't just employees. They were prisoners. As she dipped the mop into the bucket and began scrubbing, she noticed the other workers, the way they kept their heads down, the way their bodies tensed when the manager walked by. And then she saw her. Mrs. Glades. She was tall and thin, her sharp cheekbones making her look like a bird of prey. She wore a stiff gray uniform, her dark eyes scanning the room with cold efficiency. The way the workers flinched when she passed told Ella everything she needed to know. Ella focused on her mopping, hoping to go unnoticed. But then, a crash. A young bellboy had dropped a guest's suitcase, its contents spilling onto the floor. Expensive clothes, silk scarves, bottles of imported perfume. The room went silent. Mrs. Glades turned, her lips curling in disgust. "You clumsy fool," she hissed, marching toward him. Ella's fingers tightened around the mop handle. The boy, he couldn't have been older than 17, scrambled to pick up the fallen items, his hands shaking. I'm sorry, ma'am, he stammered. Mrs. Gladys reached out and smacked him across the face. Ella's breath caught in her throat. The boy staggered back, his cheek blooming red, but he didn't cry out. He only nodded and whispered, "It won't happen again, ma'am." Ella felt something burn in her chest. Rage, heartbreak, a storm of emotions she couldn't control. But she couldn't act. Not yet. For now, she was just a janitor, an invisible nobody. And yet, as she watched Mrs. Gladys walk away, a slow realization crept into her mind. She had come here to uncover the truth about the hotel's corruption. But what if the truth was worse than she had ever imagined? What if her father's legacy was built on something far darker than she had ever known? Ella took a deep breath and pushed the mop across the floor. She had started this mission to learn the truth. Now, she had to decide what to do with it, because nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to uncover. The night was long and unforgiving. Ella's arms ached from scrubbing floors, her fingers raw from the harsh chemicals in the cleaning solution. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but there was none. Not here. Mrs. Gladys was a nightmare. The head housekeeper moved like a hawk, her sharp eyes scanning the workers, waiting for the smallest mistake. She barked orders like a drill sergeant, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You! Faster! Do you think this hotel cleans itself?" Ella kept her head down. She had to. She was used to people treating her with respect, smiling at her, listening to her words. But now she was just another worker, invisible, replaceable. As she dragged the mop across the marble floor, she saw a man spill a glass of wine. The deep red liquid spread like blood across the white tiles. Before Ella could move, Mrs. Glady's cold fingers gripped her wrist. "Clean it now," she snapped. Ella nodded quickly and dropped to her knees, scrubbing furiously. The man who spilled the drink barely noticed her. He stepped aside, laughing with his friends, not even sparing her a glance. Her father had built this hotel for the rich, the powerful. He had told her it was a place of dreams, of beauty. But now, all she saw was cruelty. And then, a whisper. She was near the kitchen, mopping the hallway, when she heard voices. "I'm telling you," a chef muttered, "Mr. Montgomery's death wasn't natural." Ella froze. Another voice, lower, hesitant. "What do you mean?" The chef lowered his voice. "There are rumors. Some say he was poisoned. Some say he had enemies. And now the new owner. No one's seen her. If you ask me, someone wanted him gone." Ella's pulse raced. Her father had died from a sudden heart attack. That's what the doctors had said. That's what everyone had said. But what if they were wrong? She turned her head slightly, trying to hear more, but the voices faded as the workers moved deeper into the kitchen. Her father. Murdered? No, it couldn't be. Could it? Her mind swirled with questions, but before she could process them, a new horror unfolded before her eyes. Through a small gap in the office door, she saw something she wasn't meant to see. Mr. Raymond, the hotel's trusted manager, stood in the dimly lit room. The man her father had called his right hand. The man who had once promised to take care of the hotel, to protect it. But he was not protecting anything. He was stealing. Ella pressed herself against the wall, peeking through the crack. Mr. Raymond stood before the hotel's safe, stacks of money piled high on the desk. Two other men stood beside him, laughing quietly. "The new owner is a ghost," one of them sneered. "She hasn't shown up once." Mr. Raymond chuckled, counting the stolen bills. "As long as that clueless Harris stays away, this place is ours." Ella clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms. They thought she was clueless, absent, uninterested. They thought she wouldn't notice. They were wrong. Rage burned in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still. If she ran in now, if she screamed at them, what would happen? They wouldn't believe she was the owner. They would fire her, throw her out, and worse, they would hide the evidence. No, she couldn't act yet. She had to be smarter. She had to find proof. Ella turned away from the door, her hands shaking. Everything she had believed about this hotel, about the people her father trusted, was crumbling before her eyes. And she had a feeling this was only the beginning. The night had been hard, but nothing could prepare Ella for what happened next. She was in the middle of gathering evidence, watching, listening, piecing things together, when disaster struck. Hey there. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update, and show some love by clicking the like button. We'd also love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city in the comments below. A loud, angry voice rang through the hall. You're too slow. Ella turned just in time to see Henry, an old janitor with trembling hands and tired eyes, standing frozen in fear. Mrs. Gladys towered over him, her face twisted in disgust. We don't need useless workers here, she spat. Without another word, she grabbed his arm and shoved him toward the door. Henry stumbled. Please, he begged, his voice weak. I've worked here for 20 years. I have nowhere else to go. Mrs. Gladys frowned. Then maybe you should have worked faster. She snapped her fingers, and 2 security guards appeared, grabbing Henry by the arms. Ella's breath caught in her throat. No, this isn't right. Henry had been nothing but kind to her since she arrived. He worked hard, even though his body was weak, and now he was being thrown away like garbage. She couldn't just stand there. She rushed forward, grabbing Henry's other arm. Wait, he hasn't done anything wrong. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Mrs. Gladys turned, her eyes dark with fury. Who do you think you are? She hissed. Ella swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Please, just give him another chance. Mrs. Gladys sneered. Then, without warning, she slapped the mop out of Ella's hands. The sharp crack echoed in the hallway. You'll be next if you don't obey, she warned, stepping closer, her breath hot with anger. You're just a janitor. You do what you're told, or you leave. Ella's heart pounded. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell Mrs. Gladys exactly who she was. But she couldn't. Not yet. If she lost her cover now, she would never be able to take down the people who were destroying her father's legacy. So she clenched her fists and lowered her head. Yes, Mom, she mumbled, forcing herself to step back. Mrs. Gladys smirked in satisfaction. Henry gave Ella a sad smile. It's okay, dear, he whispered. Some of us don't have a choice. And with that, the guards dragged him out into the cold night. Ella bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing the anger burning inside her. This isn't over. She turned to pick up her mop. But then, a sharp gasp. She looked up and locked eyes with someone she hadn't noticed before. A bellboy. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his brown hair falling messily over his forehead. He stared at her with wide eyes, his mouth slightly open in shock. Miss Montgomery, he whispered. Ella's heart stopped. She knew him. Jake. He had been working at the hotel since he was a kid, running errands, helping guests, always smiling. Her father had liked him, even called him the hardest worker in the building. And now he was looking at her, seeing through her disguise. Her pulse pounded. If he says my name out loud, it's over. She took a quick step toward him, shaking her head slightly. Shay, she pleaded under her breath. Jake blinked, then quickly glanced around, making sure no one else had heard. His face was pale with shock. What are you doing here? He whispered. Ella grabbed his arm and pulled him into a quiet corner, lowering her voice. I can't explain everything right now. Just don't say anything. Please. Jake studied her, his eyes filled with confusion. But then something changed. His expression turned serious. You don't know half of what's happening here, he murmured. Ella frowned. What do you mean? Jake took a deep breath, lowering his voice even more. There's something else. Something about your father's will. Ella's blood turned to ice. My father's will, she repeated. What about it? Jake glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was listening. Then he turned back to her, his voice urgent. Your father left something behind. A different will. One that nobody wants you to see. Ella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. A different will. Her father had left her everything. That's what the lawyers had said. That's what the official documents showed. But if Jake was right, then everything she thought she knew was a lie. Ella's heart pounded as Jake led her through the narrow, dimly lit halls of the hotel's basement. She had no idea what to expect, but something in her gut told her this was going to change everything. They moved quietly, careful not to make a sound. The deeper they went, the darker the hallway became. The smell of old wood and dust hung in the air. Ella had never been down here before, but Jake seemed to know exactly where he was going. After what felt like forever, they arrived at a small, hidden room. Jake pushed the door open slowly, and Ella followed him inside. It was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. The room was filled with boxes and old furniture, but in the corner there was a locked cabinet. Jake pulled out a key from his pocket and turned it in the lock with a soft click. Ella's breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open. Inside, it was filled with dusty old papers, yellowed with age. Jake reached in and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He flipped through them carefully, his fingers trembling, until he found what he was looking for. Ella's heart skipped a beat as she saw the name at the top of the first page. Richard Montgomery. It was her father's handwriting. Jake handed her the paper, his voice barely a whisper. This is it. The real will. Ella's hands shook as she read the words. Her father had written a will years ago, before his death. But this was nothing like the one she had been shown after his passing. In this will, her father had made it clear. The hotel should not belong to Ella alone. It should be shared with the staff, the ones who had worked tirelessly to build it into what it was. The bellboys, the housekeepers, the janitors. They deserved their fair share. They were the true heart of this hotel, not the rich and powerful who came and went. Tears blurred Ella's vision as she read the last part of the will. Her father had known about the corruption. He had known what was happening to the workers, the way they were mistreated, ignored, and forgotten. And instead of leaving everything to her, he had left them a legacy of fairness and equality. Ella's chest tightened as she held the will in her hands. But someone had stolen it, someone who didn't want the truth to come out, someone who had wanted to keep the power for themselves. Suddenly, Ella heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart raced as the door creaked open. Standing there in the doorway were two of the last people she had expected to see, Mr. Raymond and Mrs. Gladys. Their faces were pale with shock, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They were caught off guard, unsure of how to react. You weren't supposed to see that, Mr. Raymond growled, his voice low and threatening. Ella stood up, holding the will tightly in her hands. But I did. She couldn't believe it. There was no turning back now. Mr. Raymond's eyes narrowed. You don't know what you're dealing with, he said. This hotel was never meant to be a charity. It was meant to be a business, and I was going to make it mine. Mrs. Gladys stepped forward, her cold eyes flashing with anger. You think you can just undo everything your father worked for? You're not capable of running this place. You don't have what it takes. Ella stood tall. I do have what it takes, and you're going to pay for what you've done. With a sudden, fierce determination, she turned to Jake. Call the police. We're exposing them. Jake nodded and quickly stepped outside to make the call. Ella could feel her heart racing as she stood in front of the people who had stolen from her father and from the workers who deserved so much more. She had the truth now, and nothing could stop her. Within the hour, the police arrived. The corrupt staff members were arrested, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. Mr. Raymond was taken into custody, his face twisted with rage. Mrs. Gladys was arrested for her cruel treatment of the workers, and the stolen money was returned to the hotel. The hotel was no longer in the hands of corrupt people who only cared about power and money. It was in the hands of the people who deserved it most, the workers. Ella kept her promise to her father. Instead of taking everything for herself, she divided the hotel's shares among the loyal workers, the bellboys, the janitors, the housekeepers, giving them a piece of the hotel they had worked so hard to build. The rich guests still came and went, but now something was different. The hotel had a new kind of wealth, honesty, justice, and a legacy built on truth. Ella's eyes filled with pride as she walked through the golden halls, no longer in disguise. She wasn't just the owner of the Montgomery Royal Hotel. She was the one who had made it right again. Her father's true legacy had been restored. And Ella, she had finally earned her place, not because of her father's name, but because of the courage to stand up for what was right. Hey there, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update, and show some love by clicking the like button. We'd also love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city in the comments below.